She fell from 33,000 feet. No parachute. No seat. No warning. Just open sky, freezing air, and a body hurtling toward the earth at the speed of a falling aircraft. By every law of physics, by every rule of medicine, by every boundary that separates the possible from the impossible, she should not be alive. But she is. And that single fact, that one stubborn, inexplicable truth, is what makes this story unlike anything else in the history of human survival. This is not a story about luck. This is not a story about miracles. This is a story about what happens when the universe makes an error it cannot take back, and one woman lives inside that error long enough to tell the world about it. Her name was Vesna Vulovic. She was 22 years old. She was a flight attendant. And on January 26, 1972, somewhere above the frozen hills of Czechoslovakia, the aircraft she was working on was torn apart in midair by a bomb. 27 people died in seconds. She fell over 10,000 meters through the winter sky, unconscious, unprotected, and alone, and she survived. Her survival was later certified by Guinness World Records as the highest fall ever endured by a human being without a parachute. The number has never been broken. The story has never stopped being extraordinary. But to understand what really happened, to understand how a human body can fall from that height and still carry a heartbeat when it hits the ground, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a perfectly ordinary day that had no reason to end the way it did. January 26, 1972. JAT Yugoslav Airlines Flight 367 departed Stockholm that morning on a routine European route. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, a reliable mid-range passenger jet, the kind that flew this corridor regularly without incident. The plan was straightforward: Stockholm to Copenhagen, Copenhagen to Zagreb, Zagreb to Belgrade. Crews had flown this route dozens of times. Passengers had booked it thinking nothing of it. There was no reason in the world to believe this particular Tuesday would be different from any other. Vesna was not originally assigned to that flight. This detail, so small and so overlooked in the hours before departure, would become the central mystery of her survival. Another flight attendant, also named Vesna, had been scheduled to work Flight 367. A clerical error in the roster mixed up the two women. Their names were similar. The paperwork was never corrected. And so without knowing it, without any premonition or hesitation, Vesna Vulovic boarded a plane that fate had never meant for her. She took her position in the rear galley section, checked the service carts, and settled into the quiet rhythm of another working day at 33,000 feet. The passengers that afternoon had no reason to feel anything unusual either. The flight was smooth. The skies over Central Europe that January were pale and cold, but the air was stable. No turbulence. No mechanical warnings. The cabin was warm and pressurized, a sealed bubble of ordinary life suspended 10 kilometers above the surface of the earth. People read. People dozed. People ordered tea and stared out of the oval windows at clouds that drifted past like nothing at all. If you had been on that flight, you would have felt safe. You would have had every reason to feel safe. What the passengers did not know, what even the crew could not have known, was that a bomb had been placed inside the forward baggage hold before departure. It had been packed there carefully, deliberately, by individuals connected to the Croatian national resistance, an extremist faction operating in the shadows of the deep political tensions fracturing Yugoslavia in the early 1970s. Yugoslav aircraft had been targeted before. There had been warnings, reports, classified intelligence passed between security agencies. But none of it had been specific enough, or acted upon quickly enough, to stop what was already sitting in the belly of that aircraft as it climbed to cruising altitude. At 4:01 in the afternoon, somewhere above the small village of Srpska Kamenice in what was then Czechoslovakia, the bomb detonated. There is no gentle way to describe what happened next. The explosion tore through the forward section of the aircraft with a force that gave no one on board even a single second of awareness. The pressurized cabin, which maintained a safe environment at altitude by holding air inside at a fraction of sea level pressure, catastrophically failed in an instant. The difference between the pressure inside and the near vacuum outside the aircraft at that altitude creates forces so violent that the cabin does not simply depressurize, it explodes outward. Luggage, objects, seats, and people were wrenched toward the rupture before the sound of the blast had even finished traveling through the fuselage. The temperature inside the cabin dropped from a comfortable warmth to nearly -50°C in seconds. Oxygen, the invisible boundary between consciousness and death at that altitude, vanished entirely from the breathable air. The aircraft did not crash. It disintegrated. The explosion compromised the structural integrity of the entire airframe, and the forces acting on the body of the plane at cruising speed, forces that the structure could only survive intact, now began to tear it apart mid-flight. The wings distorted. The fuselage fractured into sections. The forward portion of the aircraft, where the explosion had occurred, was gone almost immediately. What remained scattered across the winter sky above the Czechoslovak hills, rows of seats, fragments of fuselage, personal belongings, and 27 human beings who never had the chance to understand what was happening to them. And somewhere inside the falling wreckage of the tail section, unconscious and pinned in place by a food service cart that had broken free and slammed into her during the initial blast, was Vesna. She did not know she was falling. The oxygen deprivation that occurs at that altitude without pressurization renders a person unconscious within seconds. Her brain, deprived of the oxygen it needed to sustain awareness, had shut itself down completely before she ever left the aircraft. She felt nothing. She saw nothing. She was not falling consciously from 33,000 feet, she was simply absent from the world, her body moving through physics it had no vocabulary to resist. This is one of the details that makes her survival both more comprehensible and more surreal at the same time. The human body, when unconscious, does not tense. It does not brace for impact. It does not create the kind of rigid resistance that, paradoxically, transfers more force directly into the skeleton and organs during a collision. Unconscious bodies absorb impacts differently. The muscles are loose. The frame yields slightly instead of fighting. And in high-velocity trauma, that distinction, between a body that is fighting and a body that has surrendered to physics, can be the line between death and survival. The tail section of the aircraft was also doing something that a human body falling alone cannot do. It had mass, shape, and aerodynamic drag. It was not a smooth or controlled descent, it tumbled and spun chaotically as it fell, but it was not a simple vertical drop either. The structure caught air. It decelerated partially. The forces acting on it as it descended through increasingly dense layers of atmosphere were not the same forces that would act on an unprotected body in freefall. By the time it reached the lower altitudes, its terminal velocity had been influenced by the irregular surfaces and angles of the broken fuselage in ways that reduced the final impact speed below what clean physics would calculate for that height. The tail section struck a snow-covered slope on a forested hillside near Srbska Kamenice. And this is where the story moves from physics into something that feels almost deliberately improbable. The slope was not flat. It angled sharply, which meant the wreckage did not absorb the full energy of the fall in a single vertical collision. Instead, the impact energy was partially redirected along the slope's surface. The structure slid. The force was spread across distance rather than concentrated into one catastrophic moment. Below the thin layer of frozen surface, the snow was deep and dense, weeks of winter accumulation that compressed under the impact and absorbed a portion of the remaining kinetic energy. And then the trees. The wreckage entered a stand of dense forest, and the trees did what trees do when struck by something moving with tremendous force, they broke. Each one that snapped absorbed a fraction of the energy that would otherwise have been delivered directly into Vesna's body. By the time the tail section came to rest, buried in snow and surrounded by shattered timber, the fall from 33,000 feet had been softened by slope, snow, and forest into something a human body could survive, barely, catastrophically, against every reasonable expectation. But survive. Her injuries were devastating. A fractured skull. Both legs broken. 3 vertebrae in her spine crushed. Internal bleeding. Trauma spread across her body in a pattern that told the story of every impact from the explosion to the final rest. Any single one of those injuries, under different circumstances, could have killed her. Together, they represented a catalogue of damage that most trauma surgeons would never see on a living patient. But she was breathing. Her pulse was present, faint and irregular, but continuous. The man who found her was named Bruno Heinke. He was a local resident, not a medical professional by trade, but he had served as a medic during World War II, and the instincts from that experience had never left him. When he reached the crash site and found her partially buried in snow inside the wreckage, he did not hesitate. He cleared her airway. He kept her still. He monitored her breathing with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival in the next few minutes depended entirely on what his hands did right now, not on anything arriving from the outside world. He kept her alive until proper emergency responders could reach the remote site and transport her to a hospital in Prague. She arrived at the hospital in a condition that her doctors described quietly and carefully, because the honest description was that she should not have been alive to receive treatment at all. The surgery to stabilize her was complicated. The injuries to her spine were severe enough to cause temporary paralysis. She was placed into intensive care and monitored hour by hour. And then, when her body had absorbed as much acute intervention as it could tolerate, it made the decision that unconscious, overwhelmed bodies sometimes make: it went further into the dark. She fell into a coma. She remained in that coma for 27 days. 27 days of silence while her brain and body negotiated privately over whether to continue. 27 days while the world outside the hospital slowly began to piece together what had happened in the sky over Czechoslovakia. 27 days while her doctors watched her vital signs and adjusted medications and changed dressings and waited, because waiting was the only thing left to do once the immediate work was finished. And then one morning, 27 days after the wreckage settled into the snow, Vesna opened her eyes. Her first questions were not about the crash. They were not about the fall or the fire or the missing aircraft. Her first questions were about the passengers, about her colleagues, about whether she had completed her service duties before everything went wrong. Her memory of the event simply did not exist. Her last clear recollection was of walking through the cabin with a service cart, asking a passenger if he wanted another drink. After that, nothing. The explosion, the decompression, the fall, the impact, none of it had left a single trace in her conscious memory. It was as if the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to any human being in aviation history had occurred entirely without her knowledge. Recovery was long and painful. The damage to her spine required months of rehabilitation. The paralysis that had set in after her injuries was temporary, but overcoming it was not. She relearned how to sit, then to stand, then to walk. Each step was built on the previous one through repetition and persistence and the particular kind of stubbornness that people develop when their body has already survived the unsurvivable and there is nothing left to be afraid of. She returned to work eventually, not as a flight attendant. Her body could not manage the physical demands of the role any longer, but at a desk position with the airline. She never stopped being connected to the world of aviation that had tried to kill her. When journalists asked her what it had felt like to survive a fall from 33,000 feet, she gave them an answer they never expected. She said she was lucky. Not chosen. Not special. Not protected by anything larger than chance. Just lucky. It is the kind of answer that frustrates people who want the story to mean something more than the random alignment of aerodynamics and snow depth and one man with wartime medical training walking toward a hillside at exactly the right moment. But it is also an honest answer. Because the truth of her survival is not that the universe protected her. The truth is that the universe destroyed everything around her and happened, for no particular reason, to miss. She lived quietly after the world's attention moved on. Belgrade was her home, and she returned to it. She had no interest in building a public identity around her survival. She did not lecture or perform. When documentaries were made about her, she participated with a measured and sometimes reluctant cooperation, as though the story they wanted to tell had happened to someone else and she was simply the only witness available. The Guinness record that bears her name, highest fall survived without a parachute, 10,160 meters, remains unbroken to this day. What stays with you, long after the numbers and the physics have settled in your mind, is not the fall itself. It is what she said once about the scheduling error that put her on Flight 367 in the first place. She had not been supposed to be there. Another woman's name had been meant to fill that roster slot. The mistake was administrative, mundane, the kind that happens in every office in the world every day without consequence. Except that on January 26, 1972, that mistake sent Vesna Vulovic onto an aircraft that was about to be destroyed, and in doing so, positioned her in the one section of the plane, in the one physical configuration, in the one geography of falling wreckage, that could carry a human heartbeat all the way to the ground. She fell 33,000 feet without a parachute. And she lived. Not because the story required her to. Not because survival was written anywhere into the conditions of that day. But because the mathematics of chance, just once, on just one winter afternoon above the hills of Czechoslovakia, produced an answer that had no right to exist. And she has been living inside that answer ever since.